And now I will turn the program over to Virginia Barrett, our Vice President, who will introduce today's speaker.
Thank you, Judy. On this clear autumn day, so reminiscent of the bright days of our childhood, welcome everyone to our monthly lecture series via Zoom. We hope that you'll join us on Sunday, December 13th for a return lecture by Willow Young on Encounters with the Other, a person whose life and culture differ greatly from our own. We're delighted to welcome back as our guest speaker today, Stephen Galipeau, a Jungian analyst in private practice in Woodland Hills. He will share with us his interpretation of two of Grimm's fairy tales, Iron Hans and The Girl Without Hands. He will show us how they express key elements of the struggles of the modern psyche. He will discuss the Wildman archetype and our lost connection to nature, and the unwitting betrayal of the feminine principle, a byproduct of our modern civilization. Stephen Galipeau is president and executive director of the Coldwater Counseling Center in Studio City, a Jungian-oriented sliding scale nonprofit organization. Steve is author of The Journey of Luke Skywalker, an analysis of modern myth and symbol, as well as articles and reviews on many topics of analytic psychology. He's a frequent lecturer at the Psyche Jung Institute of Los Angeles, as well as for our club. So on the topic of fairy tales and the psyche, please welcome back Stephen Galipeau.
Thank you, Virginia. Well, welcome. This is always a new, interesting way to present because I can't have too much of a feeling of everyone. So I've got glimpses of you and we'll do the best we can with this. So we're gonna just start out with some introductory remarks, but stories just carry a terrific importance, particularly for ancient societies, just locally with the Native American groups and so on. We can see the importance of their stories, or in Africa, Lawrence Vanderpoel studied the stories of the Bushmen and other cultures. So they become really important to each culture, and ours, it's no different. And a particularly important time in our culture's development were fairy tales. So we're going to look at two of them, but I'm going to begin with some introductory remarks about fairy tales. The analyst who has probably written the most about them is Louise von Franz. So she has several books. Her first book, The Interpretation of Fairy Tales, offers some introductory insights so we can kind of set the stage. Fairy tales are the purest and simplest expression of collective unconscious psychic processes. Dissatisfaction with Christian teaching and the first longings for a more vital, earthly, instinctive wisdom have kind of allowed these to emerge out of the unconscious. But yet it's only if it has an emotional and a feeling value for an individual is it alive and meaningful. She writes that my hypothesis is that probably the more original forms of folk tales are local sagas and parapsychological stories, miraculous stories which are due to invasions from the collective unconscious. Then under favorable conditions, the account gets enriched with already existing archetypal representations and slowly becomes a story that is passed along in that culture. Personally, she writes, I think it likely that the most frequent way in which archetypal stories originate is through individual experiences of an invasion by some unconscious content, a dream or whatever, whereby an archetypal content breaks into an individual life, and it has such an effect that it's repeated in its telling. So fairy tales sort of mirror the more basic and simple structures of the psyche. They're less complicated than myth and not so entwined with the culture that produces the myth. So another question we'll ask as I tell the tale and then we talk about it is, why do we interpret? And what von Franz suggests is interpretation is an art or a craft that we can learn only by practice and experience. And its goal is to reunite the conscious psyche with what's expressed in the unconscious drama. So in earlier peoples, you didn't really have to interpret, you just told the story. But in modern times, with the development of modern consciousness, we need to reconnect to the unconscious. So we need to interpret or play with the story in a way for it to make sense and for its original meaning to come through. So we interpret, says von Franz, for the same reason as that for which fairy tales and myths are told, because it has a vivifying effect and gives a satisfactory reaction and brings one into peace with one's unconscious instinctive substratum, just as the telling of fairy tales always did to those who first heard them. So fairy tales continue to get amplified in our culture. And we can see this, one place where this happens a lot is in film. So a while back, we had the Shrek films, and they gave a different twist to the fairy tales where the actual classical hero in those tales was too narcissistic, and it's the ogre who actually becomes the one who takes one on a journey of self-realization and individuation. More recently, Disney has done other kind of films like Maleficent and its sequel, and I was struck how they played with the fairy tale tradition, but as Jung said, they could have carried it forward. And the sequel was unusual because I thought it was as good as the original, which isn't always the case. So I have an example, see if the technology will work for us here. Here's our, for this evening. So this is a cartoon from a few years back, playing on the fairy tale of the Frog King. But in this case, it's a woman bringing her partner, the frog, in for counseling. And her statement is, I thought I could change him. So it's kind of a little in reverse of the fairy tale. In the fairy tale, the young woman has to embrace the frog who has rescued her ball. And then eventually, when she does, he'll turn into a prince. This is the other way around. Someone kind of marries someone thinking they can change him into something that they're not. So that's a modern version. I want to take us now back to medieval myth and symbolism that set the stage for telling of these tales. These images come from a book called The Wildman, Medieval Myth and Symbolism by Timothy Husband. It was a product produced many years ago by the New York Metropolitan Museum of Art. And it's available now online too. You don't have to go out and track it down and buy it. You can visit it online. So the Wild Man is a figure of that dates back to the Gilgamesh epic. That in that epic, the hero, Gilgamesh, becomes too inflated. So the gods create a figure to bring him back into balance, which is Enkidu, the Wildman. But those kind of images continue right on up until our modern day. We're going to look at the medieval symbolism, but in modern times we have figures like the Sasquatch, and in Star Wars, Chewbacca the Wookiee, carrying on the wild man symbolism. The wild man is very much associated with nature. And here we see one with his stick. They often carry a club, and he's kind of located in a tree stump. The myth of the wild man or wild women gets linked with other mythologies. So here's a wild woman with a unicorn. It's the wild folk are also related to, there's two wild folk in this image with their clubs, but also issues of relationship. So there's two lovers and two wild folk in this one. Then you have the wild folk at the bottom and knights on the side and angels to the top. So in the medieval mind, the wild folk carried an element of our psychic heritage, related to other parts of our psychic heritage. This is the ecstasy of Mary Magdalene. And you'll notice she's surrounded by the angels, but she's portrayed as that wild woman from the earlier slide. Now, the wild man didn't exist necessarily alone. There were wild folk. So this is a picture of a wild folk out in the countryside with their children. Now, another interesting formulation for the wild man is one of 4 conditions of society. And we're going to kind of pass through these with our fairy tales. So that's one of the reasons I show them. So at one end are the poor. The poor as one of the 4 conditions of society. Then there's the working class, in case the craftsmen and so on. And then there are the nobles. And then there are the wild folk. So these are 4 conditions of society, and in a sense, we kind of pass through them a little bit in the various fairy tales. Particularly the first one will be the young son of a king, but he has to connect and go off and be with a wild man, and we'll see that in a minute. So the wild folk exist as part of life, close to water. See the water fountain to the unconscious, and in the background, the more civilized productions, but they live close to the earth. In this picture, they're almost living like Tolkien's hobbits. So let's see. All right. So now we're going to go to our first story, Iron Hans, and it's a Grimm's fairy tale. And I'm going to take that back so you can see the speaker. So to summarize Iron Hans, it kind of goes a little bit like this. And for those who don't know the story, there's a king and there's a forest nearby that has many wild animals. It sort of exists in its regular state. And he sends hunters into the forest, but then they bring back a deer for them to eat, but they don't return. So he does it again. He sends another hunter or two out, and they don't return. So then he sends a whole group of them out again, and they don't return. So at that point, it's too dangerous to go into the forest. And so they basically decide that they're not going to send anyone there. The forest is too dangerous. So a while later, a brave huntsman comes along with his dog, and he says to the king, I'd like to go in to the forest and see what's going on. The king is hesitant, and this hunter assures him he has no fear, and he's going to explore what's going on. So he goes into the forest with his dog, but then a hand, as they get near the water, a hand reaches up, grabs the dog, and pulls it in. So the hunter goes back, brings in other men with him with buckets to empty and drain this pool of water. And when they do so, they find a wild man at the bottom. So they bring him back and they put him in a cage. And now people are free to go into the forest. They lock him in a cage, and the king gives the key to a queen for safekeeping. So, okay. So at this point, the king and queen have an 8-year-old boy. And this is kind of a critical age in terms of development. And he's playing with a golden ball, but it rolls into the cage of the wild man. And he then goes and asks the wild man to return his ball, and the wild man refuses. So then a second time he's out playing and he's near the cage, and again he asks the wild man for his ball, and again he refuses. And the wild man's condition would be, if you let me out, I'll give you the ball. But the boy doesn't feel he can do that because his father has threatened to beat him if anybody lets the wild man out. But the king goes away. So the third time is the charm. The theme of 3 keeps appearing in the story quite often. So the third time the king is gone, and the wild man says, well, why don't you let me out? He says, I don't know where the key is. But it turns out the wild man knows that the key is under his mother's pillow. So he goes, gets the key, and gets the wild man out. But once he has freed the wild man, he's now afraid of his father's wrath, and he doesn't want to be beaten. And he tells that to the wild man. And so he goes with the wild man into the forest. And the wild man tells him, you can come with me and I will take care of you. I have lots of riches. So they go into the forest to live together, and the wild man gives him a task of sitting by a pool, a golden pond, and just to look after it so that nothing falls into the pond. So he leaves him there and goes off for the day. But the boy has a very sore finger from opening the cage. When he got the key and opened the cage, he already hurt his finger and it's hurting. So he's tempted, so he dips it in the pond and it comes out golden looking. And he tries to get it off, but he can't. And so the wild man, Iron Hans, comes and knows right away what has happened. And he says, well, I'll let it go this time, but please be careful not to let anything drop into the pond. But as it is with these stories, these myths, he's sitting there and he goes to scratch his head and one of his hairs fall in and it turns gold. So he grabs it out and the wild man comes back and right away knows, oh yes, something's fallen in. Okay, one more chance. I'll give you one more chance. So again, he leaves. And this time the boy is fascinated by his own reflection in the pond. And so as he's looking more closely, and particularly to look into the eyes of his reflection, his hair falls out over his head and into the pond. It becomes all golden. So he tries to hide it under a handkerchief, but when Iron Hans comes back, he knows right away what happened. And he tells them, well, now you definitely cannot stay with me anymore. You must go out and spend your time with the poor. So now he's moving from the wild man stage of the society into the next level. But Iron Hans tells him, you must go, you can't stay here. But you have a good heart, you help me. So at any time you need help, you can come to the forest and call for me, and I will come and help you. So the young boy journeys and eventually comes to a city, and he's looking for work, but he really has no experience. And eventually the cook for the king takes them on, and he can work and do cleanup in the kitchen and so on. But at one point, some food has to be delivered, and no one else is around, so he asks the boy to bring the food to the king. But he brings the food to the king, and the king is upset that he has a hat on, because he always covers his head to hide his golden hair. So the king is upset and tells the cook, I won't have anything to do with this. You have to get rid of him. So the cook kind of trades off with the gardener, and now the boy goes to work in the garden, in a sense, close again with nature. So he works for the gardener, and it goes well. But one summer hot day, it gets so hot he takes his kerchief hat off, and the reflection of the sun off of his hair goes to the window of the king's daughter and gets her attention. And she looks down and sees him and asks him to bring him a bouquet of flowers. So he wants to get the best flowers, so he gets wildflowers. Even though the gardener says, no, give her other flowers, and the young boy insists, no, the wildflowers are the best. So he gets wildflowers, brings them to her, and she reaches for his hat because she wants to see that golden hair. So he tries to hold back, but she sees it, and then she gives him some gold coins for bringing the flowers. He goes back to the gardener. He doesn't want to have the gold coins. He gives them to the gardener's children so they have something to play with, or and so on. So this happens again 3 times. She calls to him. She brings flowers. She tries to get his hat off. He holds on to it. She gives him the ducats. He goes back and gives the coins to the gardener's children. So this happens in this pattern of 3s. And then the next thing in the story is that the country becomes overrun by war. And the king leads his men out to war. And the young man really wants to participate. So as they all go off, he asks for a horse for himself. And they kind of laugh at him and dismiss him. They give him a lame horse that limps, that's got a bad leg. And so what he does is he goes to the forest and calls 3 times to Iron Hans. And when Iron Hans appears, he asks for a strong steed so that he could ride into battle. So Iron Hans not only gives him a strong steed and someone to take care of the lame pony, he gives him a great troop of warriors to go with him. So they join the battle at a time when the enemy is ahead and the king is losing many of his warriors, and they turn the tide of the battle and drive the enemy away. Once they've gotten the victory and gotten rid of the enemy, the boy returns with the soldiers to the forest, gives the horse back to Iron Hans, and returns to the kingdom in the city with the lame horse. And the people kind of laugh at him, but the young daughter is kind of curious about him. And so the gardener says, oh, he just got back with his lame horse. But the king wants to know and see if they can flush out who this mysterious warrior was. So they're going to hold a 3-day feast, and the award is a golden apple for each victory. So the boy returns to the forest and calls to Iron Hans, and he asks to be able to catch the golden apple. So Iron Hans gives him a red suit of armor and a chestnut horse to fight the first day. So when the princess throws out the ball, he of course is the one who's able to get in there, get the ball, and ride off, which is very upsetting to the king because he wants to know who this is. So the next day, Iron Hans gives him the outfit of a white knight and a white horse. And he goes in again and wins, gallops off, and the king is very angry. And he says, if this happens again, I want you all to go after him and wound him if you have to. So the third day, Iron Hans gives him black armor and a black horse. He rides in and he wins, but as he goes out, they're chased and he's wounded in his leg. He does get away, but there's a wound. So then the king's daughter learned that he's given the 3 golden apples to the gardener's children. And so he's brought before the king for an audience, and he admits that, yes, he is the one who won these things and turned the tide of the battle, and that they had wounded. So the king asked him, what can he give him? And he says, I'd like to marry your daughter. And even struck by his boldness, his daughter agrees. There's a big wedding. The young man's aggrieved parents arrive to celebrate. And then another king arrives, and it turns out that this king is really Iron Hans, who had been enchanted. So in all that he had done, the boy had also broken a spell on Iron Hans. So the boy journeys from the kingdom to these different layers of life and back to the royal family again. So there's a lot of symbolism in this story, but basically the theme is that there's an initiation into adulthood has to include some aspect of this wildness. Now the 3 colors have different meanings. So at the first stage with the red is mindful of Parsifal's story and his battle with the Red Knight. So it's an early stage of masculine development. And the white stage is the gleaming, shining stage, is kind of St. George, and he slays the dragon. But with the black horse, there's the shadow element is in, and he's even wounded in the process. But it also implies someone who's not identified with the persona. And so an important example of this in our story heritage is Zorro. So Zorro actually fights for right on the side, not identified with his everyday persona. So in a sense, that's the last time the boy does the same thing, meaning he's close to his humanity. So there are various movies and so on that kind of show this development getting in touch with the wildness. There was a movie in 2016, The Hunt for the Wilder People, and it's a New Zealand film, and it's very cleverly done. And in the film, there's a boy, I think a little older than 8, but prepubescent, who the social services don't know what to do with. They're just lost at the to do with. So they bring him out into the country to this home where a woman is eager to adopt him, and her husband is a much more introverted man, but he's a wild man. He basically lives off the land. So they've adopted him and brought into their way of life. But then suddenly she dies from a heart attack, and then the two of them are stuck together, this man and this boy, and the man doesn't want anything to do with him, but the boy doesn't want to go back to social services. So he tries to feign a fire in the barn that he's dead, and he goes off into the wilderness. But the man goes after him and catches up to him, but they bicker a little bit, and the man breaks his ankle. So they have to camp out there for a while and journey for a while. And then as they're coming out, they meet some hunters in a cabin, kind of a halfway house. And the way the boy describes what happens, they begin to think that maybe this wild man was using him in some way. So they have to, he doesn't want to be caught or go back to, neither of them wants to go back to the social services. So they have this adventure in the woods, and they're chased by the authorities for a long time. And in the sense that the boy is being initiated during this adventure. So eventually it ends, but the boy in the process finds a home with other Maori people because he was Maori background. And while they have a falling out, and the man has to go to prison for a year, when he comes out, the boy is waiting for him, invites him to join him with that family, and then they're going back off into the woods into another adventure. So the story captures a level of initiation that is often missing in our society. Another movie that did this is Alpha, a movie in 2018 about a Cro-Magnon boy who goes out for his first initiation with his clan. It's a buffalo hunt. There's an accident. He goes off the side of a cliff, and they have to leave because they don't know if he survived. And the tribe says to his father, the chief, that we can't sacrifice other people for him, so they leave. So he somehow wakes up, gets off the ledge, and then falls, and then ends up making a relationship with a wolf, and then journeys back to his people. And the relationship with the wolf, he's come into himself and created his own initiation. So the story in the fairy tale is coming up a lot now in our culture with these films. One more I would mention, the most recent, is called Peanut Butter Falcon. And it's about a young Down syndrome boy who is in like foster care. They put him in institutions, and they don't know what to do with him. It's a southern state, I believe, Georgia. So he actually stays with these older people. So at one point, one of these older people helps him to escape, and he goes off and he meets this kind of wild kind of guy who just lives kind of off the land, and is in a little trouble himself. But eventually in their relationship, this boy is initiated into manhood in a way that the social services just couldn't help him with. So there's a certain connection to the psyche that is needed to become an adult. When I first did this material for the Jung Institute, a book came out, and I'll mention that as the last amplification, called Wildhood. And the book is written by Barbara Naderson Horowitz, a physician who directs UCLA's evolutionary medicine program, and Catherine Bowers, a science journalist. What their research shows is this thing I'm describing that young adolescents in humans have to find is very common with many animal species, and thus the name wildhood. Basically, young animals like our adolescents need to find a certain wild independence or coming into their own in order to really make it into adulthood. So the awareness that they say that shows that the painful struggles both human and animal adolescents go through as a way of developing the skills and experience that will make it possible for them to function as adults. And this awareness is very much linked up to having a close connection to nature. And so it should be, they argue, a way to motivate humans to stop ravaging the planet. So we have places that our adolescents can grow into adulthood. So that's our first story, the story of Iron Hans. Now, Judy, you want to do questions all at the end? Yeah, okay. So that's story number one.
Well, I mean, it's up to you, what you want to do.
Well, I can go either way. We could take a couple, I mean, just see where people are. And I kind of in person like to connect to the audience a little bit. So we can, so if it clarifies things for people.
All right, so I'm allowing people to unmute themselves. And if you raise your hand, use the raised hand feature, I will see your raised hand. Okay, we have John Rash.
It's Rosh, John Rosh.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hi, John.
Thank you. Hi. This is just a question about, I want to make sure I understood something correctly. So in the story, when he comes back around, I was wondering if, so he's a prince originally, not Iron Hans, but the boy. Yeah. And then there's a king, and there's a king whose daughter he ends up marrying. And then, but I missed the detail about, does he come back into, does he reunite with his parents at some point?
Yes,
I guess that's
when at the wedding, at the very end, I mean, it's a very short part of the story. At the wedding, at the wedding, they're going to get married. His own parents come back and reunite with their son, and who they thought was lost. And
okay.
So there's the king of the daughter, there's his parents, the king and queen, and then Iron Hans shows up also now as a king.
Okay. And what transformed Iron Hans was the boys.
It's just that the boy had done right with the gifts that he had given him.
Okay, and that, okay, then that was the transformational element. Okay, yeah. Okay, I think that's all for now.
Okay.
Thanks.
Mary Miller?
Yes, I thought it was significant that the boy was looking into the water and was drawn to his own reflection.
Yes.
And I wondered if you wanted to say any more about that.
Well, it's indicative of looking, finding oneself. It goes back mythologically to the image of Narcissus looking in the pond, but not being able to connect to himself. So it's the longing, you could say, to see and be seen. So it's the deep archetypal longing is implied in that.
Thank
For
you.
that process, he has to get out into life to do that.
That's it for Mary? Okay, Hermania? We don't have,
Thank you.
we don't have your video. There you are.
Thank you. I have a question about the colors of the red, white, and black, and if you could relate them to the different stages in the alchemical sense, if there is any.
Well, the process here, and some of this is from alchemy, but some of it is, there's a whole book on this fairy tale written years ago by Robert Bly. He calls it Iron John, even though the story is listed as Iron Hans in Grimm's. The alchemical sequence would be different if you were doing the colors, but he calls this the masculine sequence and distinguishes it between the alchemist sequence and what he also calls the Great Mother sequence. So the masculine sequence of our story is red, white, and black. The alchemist sequence would be black. It starts with the prima materia. Then there's the whitening. And finally and lastly, there's the reddening or the rubetum. So in alchemy, the reddening, the coming into full humanness would come last. So there are different color sequences, and this story has the masculine sequence versus the alchemist sequence or the Great Mother sequence.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody else? I don't see any more raised hands. There was one, but it went away. Oh, John is back.
Is that okay if I ask another question?
Sure.
I didn't want to dominate or whatever, but this is just also a information question about that. The movie, was it called Hunt for the Wilder People?
The Hunt for the Wilder People. Mm-hmm.
And where did you say that was made? What country?
New Zealand.
It was, okay. I just wanted to clarify that. Okay. And I had one other question about the story and the symbolism. I was wondering I was curious about the key under the mother's pillow, and if you had any, if you wanted to speak to that symbolism at all.
Well, that in a sense, part of the young man's growing up is that part of the development is sort of the mother complex, growing out of the mother complex into some sort of independent situation. So in a sense, it's breaking sort of taboos, breaking free. So he's not fulfilling the wishes of either parent really, but his own desire, which for himself, which is represented by the desire for the ball.
Right.
So that the biggest pull is for himself, to find the self. And the key for him in this story is he has to free the wild man. And the wild man, it's freeing that which the parents or the culture at large maybe has chained up, but it's necessary for him to become a full individual.
Thank you.
Okay, Jan. Oh, you have to unmute. Jan Rhoda, there we go. Oh, you're still muted. Okay, there you go. Jan? Oh, we're not hearing you. We're not hearing you. No, we're still not hearing you. I'll go to somebody else. Maybe you can figure out what the problem is, okay? Mary Francos?
Yeah, I was wondering what is the color sequence for the Great Mother?
The Great Mother sequence mythologically is white, red, black, and it supposedly reflects the 3 phases of the moon. So the white is the color of the Virgin. Red is the color of motherhood, that is the menstruating woman. And black is the color of the crane, or the old moon. So that would be the Great Mother sequence of white, red, and black, of those 3 colors, as opposed to the male sequence, which is the red, the white, and the black.
Okay. Mary, did you raise your hand again? Mary Millett?
I did. You mentioned when you were in passing that the boy was 8 and that was a significant age.
Well, it's before adolescence, so it's an age where, as Jung would describe, that a young person is still connected to the historical psyche, the unconscious psyche. And that the problem is, as children get older, they can leave that behind. So at age 8, the boy is still at an age where things that take place in the unconscious, these kind of stories and so on, still speak to them.
Thank you.
Jan, have you figured out how to?
Yeah, that better? Can you? Okay, thanks. So, Stephen, as you've alluded to, there's not much of initiation happening these days, and the world is showing signs for it. Here in Australia, there are one at least place where initiation still happens for younger men, and it's very tough what they have to endure. But do you see any signs that initiation might return?
I'm not that involved at my age with what's going on in the education level. I do think I sort of had I consulted for a friend who ran a camp for many years down in Southern California in Julian. So, but it's part of the struggle of our time. It's really helping people grow up with a connection to nature and expose them to that. We're losing that in a lot of ways, but that would be how to do that, and ways of getting people out in nature, whether it's family visiting, national parks and things like that, but becoming aware of that world and facilitating that as much as possible. And I think it comes up in these films that I mentioned, and the films are created because we don't have the initiations, but it's helping people find that. I mean, I think it's a task very much at hand, you know, that it's a challenge. But as I say, I'm not involved with education. I have a 2-year-old grandson, so so he's got a ways to go. But his father, we took our kids out into the woods regularly for family vacations, and so I'm pretty sure he's going to do that. But I think it's exposing people as much as possible to the natural world. And there are movements and things that are happening, and it's just how much they'll take hold. There's, for instance, a process called forest bathing, which came out of Japan. And it's something that people take time out to be in something natural. And the proponents of this can even do it in the city if you can find a place where there's all trees and so on. And so you can get escape from things. Here in LA, there's a group called Tree People that are trying to get out there and plant a lot of trees. But it's those type of things that hopefully we expose young people to that would facilitate this kind of natural connection represented by the Wildman.
Thank you.
I mean, an example in our history is someone like John Muir. So he was sort of really gripped by that, but he was gripped in a lot of ways that he could have ecstatic experiences in nature, but yet perceive some of the scientific ones. He was the first one to observe that in Yosemite that was formed by glaciers. So that kind of person is what we need more forerunners, and people, you know, are following those kind of paths, and how important our connection to nature is.
Cynthia Cavalli.
This is Tom Cavalli.
Oh, hi, Tom. Tom Cavalli.
Okay, we live. I'd just like to comment on this rite of passage question. It just seems to me that in the absence of any kind of traditional rite of passage, it's not a matter of us going to nature. I think nature is coming to us in very unbidden, destructive ways. I mean, with forest fires and the polar ice caps melting, you know, I mean, I don't have to list them all. But, you know, if we don't have a rite of passage, then people don't grow up. They don't mature, they don't individuate. And all you have to do is turn on the TV anytime amidst this whole electrical to see how childish much of it is. I also want to point out, I don't really have a question, but this is more of a comment that, you know, this is an old myth, and when it came about, the relationship to nature was very different than we moderns. People during that time were immersed in nature. Nature wasn't an it or a her. It was you were immersed in it. And since, you know, modernity, we have a relationship to nature, but unfortunately, it's one that we don't take much responsibility for, and we see the.
Well, the times are different. That's true, but even the story alludes to that people, there was a fear of nature. So it went both ways. And in the founding, for instance, if you read about the founding of this country, that the forests were viewed as something to be conquered and torn down. So there was sort of an anti-nature movement that I think we're still affected by. So, and that's been countered by the national parks movement and things like that. But it still goes both ways.
Yeah.
Um,
If I could just add something else, there's also human nature. And the thing about this story that has always impressed me, that I just love, is at the very beginning. And that is when they go to the pool and they, with buckets, men with buckets, drain the pool, then they find this rusty old man, Iron Jaw, that's his name. But on an intrapsychic level, you know, I think this is a very masculine myth, by the way. It's for each of us to find a wildness that we have lost touch with. You know, we've become over civilized. And I think that this archetypal man is a way of bringing that back to us.
yes, no, absolutely. And that's why the part of the 4 stages of society, and it's one part of that, and we lose that, but we still keep creating myths. So there's still the Sasquatch myth. There's a place in Northern California you can go to, because supposedly they saw Bigfoot up there. So you can go visit the place where they took pictures of Bigfoot. So it's still something in the psyche we're imagining and looking for. And I think it comes up again in the Star Wars myth and other places where that level of the psyche.
I actually do have a question that something you just said spurred. Do you see a relationship between the wild man and the green man?
Well, there is a relationship, definitely. It's just the myth of the green man comes more, I think, out of Ireland and so on. But so there's an overlap. So people who come out of the green man myth see that is the top big thing. But the myth started in the Gilgamesh, as far as we know with myth, it started in the Gilgamesh epic. So I think there's a relationship. It just depends which country, in this case, or which place it emerges. But definitely there's a relationship.
Thank you.
So
We have another raised hand.
okay.
Armenia again.
Hi, I was wondering if you could say something about the elaborate gardens during the 18th and 19th century. Jung had mentioned them and said that they were a necessary step in trying to come out of the wilderness.
The what garden?
Come out of the unconscious and bringing greater consciousness. And so could you say something about this, the pendulum swing between the positive and the negative aspect of the wild man? For instance, the wild man as in the barbarian and the warmonger, and the wild man as something that we have to integrate as a way towards balance.
Well, I think it's a level of consciousness that if it's on the unconscious, it can erupt out of its shadow side. If it's pushed down, it comes out as the shadow side. If it's made more consciously, then it's something sort of instinctive and related. The plus and minus has to do is how we're related to it. If we're the unconscious takes the attitude towards us that we take towards it. So if we reject it, then it acts in kind. If we accept it, it responds in kind. And as the fellow alluded to, the way we're dealing with nature is responding in kind. We're getting more and more extreme weather because we're not paying attention to what we're doing as far as affecting the climate. So that's the broader issue. And something represented by the wild man would be closer connected to that nature. And for this, so we don't have the time and for this show, but another way to work with the imagery of those 4 stages of civilization are the four functions, and that the wild folk represent the inferior function, but by nature, it only lives at an instinctive level. And so it brings us back to nature. And that's what Jung did. He built his tower at Bollingen, and he eliminated some of the things at his main house and made it more primitive so he could live closer to nature. So that would represent something kind of stepping back and getting closer to nature somehow. And that can be the woods, the forest, or even gardens. The book, the movies like The Secret Garden or something. There are other ways that one can connect to that aspect of life.
Thank you.
This will be the last one. Alexander Hill.
Hi, thanks. It's a great fairy tale. I remember when the book on John came out 30 years ago or so. The whole point seemed to be in that book, the separation from the mother. He's got to get the key from under the mother's pillow to unlock the Wildman. And so it came as a great revelation to me to read in Karenyi that there is actually a God for separation from the mother, excuse me, Apollo. Apollo is the god of separation from the mother. And I don't know how much he's associated with initiation, but I believe he is. What do you think about that?
Well, I think it also depends on one's typology. But in Greece, there were different forms of initiation through various gods, not just Apollo. Dionysus was one.
Well, Dionysus is surely the wild man.
Right. And it's connection to all that represents. So that was a split that Jung talked about, the Apollonian Dionysian split. But depending on one's typology, then I think either or both can help sort of separate from the mother. But in both ways, in what the story implies, it's becoming an individual other than what the parents imagine you to be. That's ultimately, particularly if parents have preconceived ideas of what a child should be, then it's going to be important to find that ball, that self, that's separate from that. So let's move on to our other story, which is basically the story of a young girl. It's the girl without hands, or the handless maiden. Because the devil appears in it, I'd like to just mention that the devil does appear in various fairy tales, and it's Middle English term and comes from the Greek diabolos, which means slanderer. So it means to slander, set at variance, or throw across. So the devil is that which sets us at variance with ourselves, with others, and with the natural world. So that's a figure we're going to see. So that's a little bit about the roots. So the story, this story is found in many places in Jungian works. It's in von Franz's The Feminine and Fairy Tales. It's in Robert Johnson's The Fisher King and the Handless Maiden. It's in Donald Kalshed's Trauma and the Soul. And it's the last story dealt with by Clarissa Pinkola Estes in her book, Women Who Run with the Wolves. Now, this theme has a history going back beyond fairy tales. It's found in Greek myth. Agamemnon sacrifices his eldest daughter, Iphigenia. It's even in the biblical myths. In the book of Judges, there's a story of Jephthah's daughter. And Jephthah is an Israelite who made a vow to Yahweh that if Yahweh delivered the enemy, the Ammonites, into his hands, then the first person to meet me from the door of my house when I return in triumph from fighting the Ammonites shall belong to Yahweh, and I shall offer him up as a holocaust. So as it turns out, the first person he meets when he gets home is his daughter. And since he has pledged this sacrifice, then it has to be. And the daughter even says, yes, well, you've given a promise to Yahweh, so you can't unsay what you've said. So there's background mythologically for this story, which starts with a miller who's on the edge of poverty. So it's the other end of that spectrum, medieval times. And he has a mill, which is a mechanical business operated to grind grain into food, and he owns a large apple tree. This man is rather naive. So in the forest, he meets a figure who promises him wealth and riches if he gives him whatever is behind his mill. Now, what's behind his mill, he thinks, is the apple tree. But then when he gets home and his wife comes out and says, we have all these issues, what went on? He explains what happened, and he signed papers to this effect. And his wife says, well, it was our daughter who was back there. You've basically given over our daughter to the devil. So von Franz even points out that even to sacrifice the tree and everything it symbolizes, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, means to sacrifice one's own soul. So in a sense, this man has been seduced to sacrifice his soul in order to have riches. So this theme of giving up trees is a big part of our relationship to nature. It's a big part of Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, where the white wizard who goes over to the dark side, so to speak, starts cutting down all these trees to build an army of orcs. And so out of the forest come the Ents, the Treebeard and the Ents, to respond to what's happening. And basically, the two hobbits that meet Treebeard mention, ask Treebeard if they know the wizard Gandalf, and Treebeard replies, yes, I do know him, the only wizard that really cares about trees. So the girl herself is, she's pious, and she draws a circle around herself in chalk. In a sense, she holds on to her innocence, which is something that Kalshed talks about in Trauma in the Soul. She keeps herself clean so the devil can't touch her. So the devil comes for her, but she's clean. They say, so he insists they take the water away from her. But then she cries out of what's happening. Her tears, and so her tears, the moisture of her soul, keep her clean. And because she's a woman of true feeling, it's her feelings are there. So then the devil orders the father to cut off her hands, or he will take him, the father. So the father pleads with his daughter to go along, and she She says she will. But then when he cuts off her hands, her tears so keep the hands, the arms clear that the devil still can't get at her. So she is not tempted. And then the father says, I stay here, I will take care of you, I have all this money. And she says, no, I can't stay here. I'm going to put my faith in finding compassionate people. I'm going to go out into the world. So these events pulled her out into the world, much as the wild man pulled the young boy out into the world. We see some similar imagery even in the Star Wars movies, where Luke Skywalker loses his hand when he refuses, at the point he refuses to join his father's desire for them to rule the galaxy as father and son. So that symbolism, it comes into our own time. So this young girl goes off and she comes to a garden, and it's surrounded by a moat of water and she can't come in. But kind of like the Exodus, an angel appears who dams up the water so she can go in. And then she eats one fruit, one pear, they're pear trees. And that's all she needs. She eats only what she needs. The pear is generally considered a feminine fruit. So when the king arrives the next day, he's aware that there's a missing pear. Something is missing, and he talks to the gardener, and the gardener says, well, I saw a spirit and I saw an angel, and they went in and the spirit ate the pear, but because there was an angel there, I didn't want to interrupt. So they come back the next day with the priest, who they think will talk with the spirit, and they find out the girl and what happened to her, and he has compassion for her and marries her and makes her silver hands. So similar to we see in Star Wars, where the characters then get silver or metallic hands. Now, then in the story, the king has to leave. In the von Franz version, she says he goes to war, and that seems to fit other fairy tales and so on. So he gives the girl, his wife, to his mother to take care of, and they are expecting a child. But the devil still wants to injure this young queen somehow. So when the child is born, the grandmother sends a letter to her son about what has transpired. But the messenger falls asleep at a certain place, and the devil changes the message. He twists it. So the message that the father gets is that a monster has been born. And yet the king isn't fazed at all, and he sends a message back, well, please just take care of them. But then the messenger goes and gives a message, and it comes out different. And so what they receive is not what the king sent, but a message that the queen and her child must be put to death. The old mother simply could not do this. And since the last letter that is exchanged asks for the queen's tongue and eyes, something similar to what happened in the fairy tale Sleeping Beauty, the king's mother then decides that they send a hind's eyes and tongue, or keep those and send the girl off so she will be safe. The old mother weeps at this because the girl isn't with her and her grandchild, and the young girl goes off and then ends up in the woods, out in the wild world. And out there in the woods, she comes across a woman in white who turns out to be an angel and who invites her into a little cabin and who will take care of her. And then she will stay here 7 years, which is a symbolic number, a period of 7 years for transformation. And during this time, her own natural hands come back. So this is what happens to the young woman. So eventually she can kind of get a hold of life again in her own way. Now the king finally returns, and when he believes his mother had done as the evil one had instructed, he wept. And the mother, seeing the truth and the depth of his grief, tells him what really happened, and that his wife had gone off in the woods. And so now he will go off in search of his wife for 7 years, stopping at nothing until he finds her. So eventually he comes into the same forest, and the angel realizes he's there and invites him in. He lies down, puts a handkerchief over his face, and we learn that the son's name is Sorrowful, talking, that it sort of carries the painful separation of what happened to this couple. And then they come out, and the king sees that this woman has human hands. And so at first he doesn't believe her, but the angel brings out the silver hands, and then he rejoices that he has found his wife. And so they're married again. And in a sense, there's a great wedding celebration. So the young woman has gotten her human hands, which means now that they're reunited, that they really can touch and be touched by each other and have a deep relationship. I do want to comment on what happens in the separation. This is true in a lot of ways. When there's separations of different kinds, the devil gets into it, or the unconscious gets into it. Now, even simply in my own experience, for instance, if my wife says, I'm going to go out and meet a friend, we're going to get caught up, I'll be home at 10 o'clock, that's just great. But I've noticed over the years that it gets to be about 10:30, and then my mind starts playing around. Well, is she okay? Did anything happen? 11 o'clock. Uh-oh, what's going on? So my anxieties start increasing. So she gets home and we're glad. But then I've realized that if she's going to go out and she's going to be late, I ask her to please call me so the devil doesn't get going in my psyche. Another place that we see this that's very common as psychotherapists is when there's separation or breaks. I'm seeing someone for a year, but my summer vacation comes, and certain things can happen that are, you have to be very careful to look at what happens and how does the person feel about it. And often in early work, they can't express how they feel about what happened in the break. So I noticed in many years ago, but that a common experience, if I came home after, say, a 2-week vacation, and then I had a next appointment with someone, they would cancel that appointment. And then we'd meet the next time. So when we talked about it, it also became clear that because of the separation, they had feelings about it. So they then treated me as I had treated them, even though they really wanted to get together. So that it's ways that the unconscious kind of creeps up or the devil gets in there. So the devil got in there in the father-daughter relationship, and she was sacrificed, but she still was haunted by the devil getting in there with her relationship, with her marriage relationship. And eventually, after this period of, sort of introversion, you might say, or in the forest, then that parental wound was healed, and she could make then the real connection to her husband, and vice versa. So I wanted to make those comments. I also wanted to note that we talked about, someone had mentioned earlier with the other fairy tale, that the handless maiden is a medieval fairy tale. But as I poked around in preparing for this material, I've noticed that there's novels. There was a novel in 1998 by Lorraine Brown called The Handless Maiden. And it's a story of a young woman who's growing up, and there had been sexual abuse and so on in her history. Haunted one afternoon, she gets a gun when feeling threatened by an abusive grandfather, but accidentally shoots herself in the hand, and she was a pianist. So she has to give up that part of herself, and she eventually becomes a composer. So the author picked the very tale from the title from this fairy tale. And then I also came across a Native American story, The Handless Maiden, a Lakota mystery. This goes back to 2014. And it's a powerful story, and there's a young woman who turns up missing and her hands are missing. So it becomes a mystery of what's happening between the Native people and the government officials. And it turns out there are shadow people on both sides that are behind this. One of the things that the novelist was trying to get to is the fact that in our culture, there are more Native American women killed that we don't know about. That we spend less effort into finding out what happened to them and solving those mysteries. So the book was also kind of getting to this collective issue as well as creating a mystery on the reservation. So we are still sacrificing women or parts of them in our culture, not just something that happened in the Middle Ages. So that's that story in a nutshell.
Are we ready for more Q&A?
Sure.
Don't see any raised hands. There's one. Okay, Mary Millett.
Yep, sorry to have another question, but I'm wondering why the wizard or the devil wanted the young maiden in the first place.
Well, that's a good question. And I think there's, in a sense, the way I see it is there's a temptation to get something else. And there is a pattern in fairy tales, isn't it the only one, where the devil wants souls. It wants to trick people out of what we would say in depth psychology, their integrity. Or in the myth of Star Wars, the seduction to the dark side. So there's a seduction to power, and in this sense, it's the seduction for riches. And in that seduction, the devil gets a soul. And that's not uncommon in fairy tales.
Well, my question is, does he feel a need for the feminine himself?
Well, it's hard to say, but yes, in a sense, we could say he has a devilish approach to getting the feminine, but it's not going to work because this girl is too honest. She can hold on to her innocence, and she's not seduced, but the father is.
Thanks.
Robert Johnson talks about in his comment, he sees it as every time the temptation to every time to take a new modern advantage, that something makes it easier, or we can make more money, or something like that, that each time there's a seduction, there's we have to watch that we aren't losing a part of our soul. And so he sees that as something starting back way then that's just moved on. And the story is thus a reminder of the choices we make and why we make them.
Yeah, that's helpful.
I don't see any raised hands. I have two comments going back to Iron Hands, although I see a raised hand, so we'll take that first. I'll save mine. David Bloom.
Hello. It goes back to your first, now that we have a little time at the end, about the Wildman. Not so much his connection to nature, but I really feel like with the Donald Trump, I don't know what you want to call it, phenomena, that psychologically he's a type of wild man. Again, he's not so much connected to nature, but I feel like we're living in an era where this almost berserker wild man character is ongoing as we speak. And because I just love your perspective on things, I was just wondering, and wild men don't necessarily have to be good necessarily or bad, but I just was curious on archetypally, do you think he's serving, what kind of function is he serving right now in our society?
Well, that's quite a question. Jung has a statement in the Houston interviews that's found in C.G. Jung speaking, that the world in America especially is extroverted as hell. So in our selections of people for presidents, the last president we elected was an introvert. And people complained that he was too analytical and that he didn't act fast enough. So we elected an extrovert. With the descriptions of this extrovert, he doesn't introvert at all. He doesn't reflect at all. So, and that typologically, he doesn't look at facts. So I think he's extroverted, intuitive. And so anything that comes up in his mind, it's a fantasy, for him is a fact. And there's nothing that counters it. So there's no, from typology point of view, there's no integration of other functions. from a relational point of view, there's no exchange back and forth of ideas or maybe this or maybe that. So if you don't agree with him, you're fired. This seems to be the pattern, going back to his TV show. But what that is unconsciousness and it's craziness. But in the context I'm talking about, it's not wildness. He lives in, in New York in a high-rise apartment with all sort of gold stuff. So he was more like the emperor in the fairy tale, the emperor's new clothes. He's just sort of isolated and out of touch with things, and everyone just sort of mirrors that. He's naked, but that's to me isn't wildness. I'm trying to, a person closer to that who was a president would have been Teddy Roosevelt, who actually came out and met with John Muir to experience I think the sequoia trees and things like that. So he would have had that wild nature, and some of the stories about him, the Rough Riders and so on. But it was connected to something deeper that there's no evidence in the current president of even awareness of the environmental crises and climate. And someone connected to what I'm referring to, the wild man or that archetype would be like John Muir and other people deeply affected emotionally by what's happening with the environment.
Okay, Herminia again.
Yes, I have a question about
Oh, whoops. You got muted.
I have a question about the idea of the devil. Why would he want her? And as you were speaking, different movies were coming to mind, like Indecent Proposal, Cape Fear, and even Job, and the story of Job in the Bible. And it's the idea that, is it like an envy of goodness or innocence that attracts the devil, and or what is termed the devil? And is envy the wrong word, because that's really a human thing, and the devil is an archetype from the unconscious? So could you speak to that idea, please?
Well, I think envy is something that the devil can get a hold of. I'm trying to think, there's Anne Ulanoff, I'm trying to remember the name, did a book on envy.
Yeah.
And I think called Cinderella and Her Sisters. So now we've got that reference in the fairy tale. So the envy is really destructive, and it's and being envy can be really destructive. But the envy is someone, you don't have something in yourself, so you believe someone else has it, and you want to get it, so you envy them. Now, in sometimes in situations, that person may not even have what you think they have, but you envy them anyway. So you act destructively towards them. So in the fairy tale, I think I have to refresh my memory about what Ulanoff would say about it, but that's a fairy tale where the sisters just envy her, and she has to find a way to connect to what's authentic in herself. And then that eventually comes through the fairy godmother.
So is that the function of the devil in these stories, where the devil is the activating agent that will bring to consciousness something in the character.
Yes,
So,
well, in a sense, it brings forth something. So in this case, it seduced the father, but it brought forth an integrity in the daughter that she wouldn't sacrifice. And she wouldn't even let herself stay to be cared for by the father. She went in search of honest relationship, compassionate people. So she took the risk to go out into life seeking some honest relationship. And then eventually in the woods came back to herself. So that the devil is sort of the temptation to go the wrong way, to go that wouldn't be the way of individuation, or to follow the impulse in the first fairy tale. The boy is going to hold on to his ball and he's got to get the ball.
so would you characterize her wounding or and then as an obstacle and a test of her own courage and resilience, or to find herself actually?
Yes, well, she basically had that resilience and courage to go out and into the world, and it was a risk. And that the same is true with the boy. Now, I can either stay home and then I suffer what my parents give me, or I can go with the wild man. And for her choices, well, I can stay home. Dad said he'd take care of me with no hands, or I can go out into the world, and I trust that I'll find honest people, compassionate people.
So the tests are the initiation then.
So it's kind of a test of one's stamina and one's integrity.
Okay. Thank you.
John Rash. Whoops. John.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, great. First of all, I wanted to ask just a quick question. Could you say the term you used again to describe the devil in the very beginning?
It comes from the Greek diabolos.
And it means, but there was an S. There was a word that started with S, I think.
Yes. Diabolos, slanderer.
Slanderer, okay.
To set at variance, to throw across.
Okay, all right. So I was curious about, I had a thought kind of related to what David was saying earlier about where we find ourselves politically right now. And I was thinking of it more, not so much as like necessarily Donald Trump representing the wild man, but almost as though he's the projection of like the wild man that folks maybe have not been able to integrate themselves. So it becomes like sort of the shadow projection or something. I don't know how to really describe it exactly, but it's almost like, because you hear people, and you mentioned something about feeling too like kind of cultured or too, I forget the term that you use, but you hear people oftentimes they sort of rail against political correctness, right? Sometimes, and I wonder if it represents a form, almost like an like a form of the wild man expression, but like an inauthentic, possibly form of it, because we haven't had those, because we don't have those initiation rites and that kind of thing. And it doesn't, we don't have a way of doing that so much in our culture. And Anyway, and I think a lot of times young men, what stands in as an initiation rite is kind of along the lines of what you were saying about us being such a extroverted culture. Is it's about like going out and partying or something like that, and that has taken the place of what a real wild man experience would be. And then, like somebody was saying earlier, nobody grows, people don't grow up. And I was also wondering if there's maybe some overlap between these two myths, in the sense that the person who doesn't incorporate the wild man in a positive way, then that wild man becomes this devil, the slanderer, the one who can't tell the truth and is sort of out of touch with reality, at variance with people and the natural world and basically himself. And that seems to be reflected also in our current circumstances right now too. So I just wanted to throw all that out there and see what your thoughts are about it.
Well, it's a tricky one with the Wildman. I mean, it's interesting. There was a book that came out before the last election in 2016 by a bunch of Jungians, and it was called Narcissism in the Age of Donald Trump. Mm. And this was before he was elected that the book came out. So it was sort of Jungians kind of intuiting what the gestalt was in the country and writing different articles about that. So there's sort of thus a self-absorption, what's good for me is that's fine. And that's disconnected. The Wildman would represent someone who has compassion and connection and conviction, would be, kind of involved. So I'd have to go like to an image like Chewbacca is not narcissistic, but what's going on from a feeling perspective in when he's present from his reactions. And he'll have a reaction to something that's selfish or not feelingly connected. So I don't think we're in that realm. I think that the wild man, there's a sense of community and connectedness. That's why I showed those pictures of the wild families and so on. So they're, and it's a part of nature and a part of things, or a part of reacting in the best way to a given situation, let's say like the pandemic. So what's we have life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. So to me, life is first. So do we act on the behalf of life as it's being recommended, or do we do whatever we want? Now, some of it sounds to me as if people are saying, I don't want anyone telling me what to do, so I'm not going to do it. So, but that's not acting that's a divergent behavior from actually facing what's really going on. Mm-hmm. And that the wild man doesn't do that. The wild man is connected to life, and the wild woman, or the wild folk.
I don't want you to suggest. I don't want you to think that I was suggesting that we're in a good place where that's concerned.
No,
Yeah, I would say. I mean, I get what you're saying is that the authentic wild man is the way you're describing. I was just suggesting that maybe because we haven't had the opportunity for that wild man to emerge in that sort of authentic, formed way, it's come out in these other sort of sideways, sort of a bastardized version of it, or a way that some people are trying to grasp onto something that they think resembles that. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, well, I think part of what we're grappling with is what Jung talked about is, and beginning in psychological types, that we have to know how to make a sacrifice and to make sacrifices, and that the Western culture was running into a problem with that as it emerged out of Christianity. And so even back to the First World War, he felt we don't know how to make sacrifices, so we sacrifice other people. And that's where we've lost the ability to know how to stop ourselves. And he's also getting to the typology and to bring in another function. So we're extroverted as hell, and our inferior function is, as a culture, is introverted feeling, which would be what is the most important thing right now. And I think something instinctive would, like the wild man would, or the wild woman, would help us get down just what's important now with the healthcare crisis and the environment and those type of things. How do we serve life in the best way possible?
Right. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I don't see any more raised hands, and maybe that's actually a very nice way to end.
Okay.
With that thought, unless you have another parting thought for us.
Well, I have a couple, I make it work, parting images.
Oh, wonderful.
We did Iron Hans. Oops. It's not working. It's stuck.
Did you go out and back in again?
That's what I'm going to try. Okay, we did the girl without hand. So this is what I wanted to end with.
Mm.
This is nature untouched. This is our fall nature and getting connected to it and so on. That's where we like to be. This is a place my wife and I have been going to for 30 years, and we love to go up in the fall to see the aspen trees. But it's also the place where one of the fires hit. The Sequoia Complex fire, which was the largest fire ever in Tulare County, the largest fire ever in Sequoia National Forest. And what we face today is what's happening in the world and the environment. So where do we turn? Well, we walked out into all of that. And what we found is already new growth is starting to come up. So my concluding remarks are that I hope I presented the young boy in the Iron On story and the young girl of elements or places of potential for growth in the world as we have it now. And the growth that can, be sustained as a part of nature and nature's efforts to restore itself. So those would be my concluding remarks.
Well, thank you. Thank you. You want to get out of that and we can just say goodbye to you.
Sure. There we go.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. That was really, really interesting and a lot to think about.
Well, you're welcome.
And I hope we'll
Thank you for the
see
invitation.
everybody again in December.
Thank you.
Happy Thanksgiving, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
Very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.